to the Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us for our webinar about scaling lean and agile metrics. I'm Heidi Helfand.
And I'm Tim Doherty.
Yeah, we both work at Procore Technologies. We're really excited to update you on the work that we've been doing at Procore to help teams get more effective. And Procore is a company that we work at. The headquarters are in Southern California and Carpinteria, California, but we have offices globally. And we make software for the construction industry. So it's our vision to really improve the lives of everyone in construction. And we're really happy to do that. And part of that, attaining that vision, involves more effective ways of working. So we'll be showing you some techniques that we use within Procore R&D in order to help us attain that vision. As many of you are probably familiar with, we're not immune to the fact that we have a lot to do. And I know other people do as well. Sometimes it feels like there's so much work that we have going on and it's really hard to keep up, but it's so super important to keep doing it because we want to attain that vision. We want to improve the lives of people in construction. But we found that once you slow things down a little bit, sounds maybe counterintuitive, but if you have less work going on at once, you can become more effective teams and you can deliver more frequently. So a lot of this work that we're going to talk to you about really helps to try to solve the problems or the challenges that you might have when there's too much work in process or in progress at your company. And so we always also have a commitment to our customers to answer the question, the legendary question, when will it be done? So in all the software that we're building, the features, the fixes, people want to know the answer to this question. And there's different ways that in the software industry, that we have attempted to answer this question in the past. Estimation is a tradition that many of us are familiar with, and it's really almost like guesswork. And what Tim and I have found throughout the years is that there are other tools and techniques that you can use to augment estimation or even replace it. And so we're going to be sharing some of these techniques from the lean agile space. So one day we met this guy, Dan Vicanti. He's the author of a couple of books, When Will It Be Done? And Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability. And we became students of the work that he teaches globally. And it's the work that we'll talk about diffusing at Procore today. So we really found these techniques both of us have been in the industry for many, many years, and we found that a lot of these techniques really make sense and eliminate a lot of the guesswork involved in estimation. So we find that we can engage with teams to help increase their confidence in giving better statements of when work will be done. So we really wanted to bring Dan to Procore to teach us and our squads how to get better at making forecasts for delivery. So the first thing that we did was get a proposal together. And this is some of the information that we included in an internal proposal. So kind of stating our problem statement, we have a lot of work in process and we really need a better strategy for forecasting. We proposed a solution to bring in this wonderful consultant to teach us things that we could later teach on our own at Procore. And we provided some other background material, as you can see here, like a course outline, some case studies. There are other companies that we had heard of and that we had interacted with who use these techniques. And so we provided all of this background data to our execs, and we got approval to bring Dan in. And we brought him in for a couple of different trainings over the past year.
Let's take a step back for a minute. Where did this idea come from? And who are we going to recruit to join us on this journey? Well, the very beginnings of this idea came from actually an event that Heidi put on. She had successfully persuaded the leaders of R&D to take the entire organization offline for 3 days to crowdsource the most important things that we could focus on over a 90-day period. Mine was technical debt, and it was crowdsourced as the #1 initiative. And what I found in over 2 decades in software engineering is that the primary culprit in unconsolidated technical debt is unsustainable development. If teams are constantly scrambling to the finish line, so close to that red line that they have no slack in the system, they're much more likely to cut corners and much less likely to remediate it. So I started holding these sessions on sustainable development tactics. Things like building in Slack, focusing on quality first, focusing on testing, communication, proper estimation. And during this, Heidi brought Dan's work to my attention, and it really clicked. The engineer in me in particular was drawn to the mathematics behind it, even though Dan will tell you that the math is really not the important or interesting part of it. Anyway, we had this idea, as Heidi said, then to bring Dan on site. And we thought that the best people to trial this for us, the best people to go through this training were the people that were hungry for tools in this space. So we brought Dan on site for a 2-day workshop. And we brought in 3 squads whom were somewhat familiar. They had already gone through the sustainable development sessions that I had run, and they were hungry for change. And we brought Dan on site, went for 2 full days through this. It was a lot to throw at teams, but we found that because these teams wanted it, because they were hungry, they were engaged, and they took away from this things that were actionable. And in fact, we had a great testimonial from one of the engineering managers that went through that workshop. And basically, the nutshell of it was that they were spending a tremendous amount of time estimating. They were in a particularly high-profile project that was very demanding in terms of meeting expectations with the customer. They had been spending an inordinate amount of time estimating, and yet they still felt like they weren't confident in those estimates. And you can see the engineering manager here saying that they basically started sanity checking their estimates with the Monte Carlo simulations, and it gave them then confidence in what they were doing. So it turns out that this was fairly popular, and word spread. Procore has a very strong organizational culture with great spirit of openness, and people started hearing about this, and people were interested. So with that, we decided it would be a great idea to bring Dan back. We made a pitch to leadership, and we wanted not only to spread this further to squads, but more importantly, we wanted to go back into this training, Heidi and I ourselves, with a train the trainer mentality so that we could then facilitate this kind of training in-house. And we got so enthusiastic about it, Procore has the spirit of openness, that we took it straight to our president. And Steve Zahm is a very data-driven guy. He loves to say the data is the data, and he's always keen to hear tactics that are improving the way we do our work. So we went and spent what was supposed to be a half hour, turned into an hour, talking with him about this, just generally making him aware that we were making these improvements, and also to get his informal support for continuous improvement. And we were so enthusiastic, we may have forgotten to include some of the people along the way that we should have, including my boss.
So I think we were met with a lot of healthy skepticism, and it was kind of like, all right, you've got these tools and techniques. Let's really dig in there, Heidi and Tim, and prove that these actually work. And we thought that was a fair response. Like, it's great to be challenged, and this is a sign of really great leadership when our leaders challenge us to do even more and to learn even more. Procore is a big culture about learning, and so we set out to do a formal experiment. Yeah, so we got our heads together and we came up with an experiment plan, and then we conducted it. So just to recap a little bit, so we had Dan come for our first workshop in the beginning of the year, and then later in October, we wanted him to come the second time, but we wanted to put more formality around that, as well as learn techniques so that we could teach it ourselves once he had left. But we really wanted to see what the data would say. Like, were we just going on our impression that this would make a difference? We had these great testimonials. How could we actually try to dig in there and prove that they made a difference? So that's what we sought out to do. So we came up with a few hypotheses, as you can see here. So with the squads that were interested in pursuing this with us, we had a sample size there, and we worked towards these hypotheses, we thought that cycle time variability would be reduced with using the tools that Dan taught us. We'll call them the Actionable Agile tool set. We thought that the work in progress limits, remember from the beginning of the presentation with all that candy going through, we thought that using these tools, we had a hunch that we would reduce the work in progress. And also we thought that the flow efficiency would be improved. So these are the hypotheses that we got together for our experiment. And then we embarked on getting the squads to become involved in this. And as you can see here, I'm not going to read everything on this slide, but we asked way too much of them for using these materials and using these tools and techniques. And so I think we wanted everything. I think we were really excited to see that this stuff could make a difference. We wanted to really show it. And so we kind of like took a fire hose approach, which really, well, how did that go?
Well, how did it go? Not entirely swimmingly. The first thing that we found was, any system is only as good as the data that comes into it. Garbage in, garbage out is the saying. And what we found is that as people started to visualize their process, it became clear that they had some data cleanup to do. So if we look at one sample squad, we found that the most common culprit here was they had workflow states in Jira that weren't mapped to, they had process states that weren't mapped to their workflow. In particular, they had abandoned tickets or things that were honorably discharged. And Jira still considered those to be in progress. And so here is an example of this squad going in one day and cleaning up a bunch of stale tickets. You can see this one has been in progress for 383 days. So it's clear that they can't do much with their cycle time, stability, or work in process limits with this stale data. We also found that people are creatures of habits. That should be no surprise to anyone who's a human being. And we found that while the team members that attended the workshop were really gung-ho, when the rubber hit the road and they went back to their day-to-day workflow, they tended to revert to old habits, even when they weren't helping them. And then lastly, we had the bright idea to schedule this workshop and the 90-day experiment window right as the holidays were approaching. We had in rapid succession Thanksgiving and then the winter holidays. And so that did impede us somewhat. Nonetheless, we did get some results, and as we'll share, the results were promising. But first, we got really kind of naive. What we're looking at here are cycle time scatter plots. And in a nutshell, that green line in either chart shows the trend line for the 85th percentile, or 85% of the time. That's how long it took for tickets to get done. And we looked at this and said, this is a slam dunk. I mean, if you look at the one on the left, it's all over the place. The one on the right is much flatter, but we made the naive mistake of sampling from the beginning of time on the left-hand side and the 2-month experiment window on the right. And that's really just comparing apples to oranges. So we had to be a bit more realistic. But even as we go and then compare equivalent sample sizes, 2 months prior to the experiment with the 2-month experiment window, here's a before for a team, and you can see that that cycle time trend goes up and down a fair bit. We have looks like about a 35-day peak and somewhere around probably a 4-day trough there. So quite a bit of variability. And we look at the 2-month experiment window, we see that that stabilizes quite a bit. We see about a 5-day delta there, something like that. So this is definitely improvement. And as we extrapolate and look at all the squads, we see that, in fact, 4 out of the 5 squads had a decreased range in cycle time. This is what we predicted. 1 didn't. We'll ignore that for now. And then in addition to that, we didn't want to focus on the overall cycle time decreasing, because we knew that we had lots of stale data to be cleaned up, and that it's much more important to get stable first and then worry about overall cycle time. So the next metric we looked at was work in process. And again, the total work in process we knew would be skewed by those tickets that were abandoned. But what we can do again is we can look at the range. So while we did see in that top one, the total work in process decreased, sometimes significantly. In some cases, that was a result simply of cleaning up stale data, tickets that were technically in process according to the tool, but weren't really in process for the team's context. But if we look at the range, that is the max and min work in process. That tells us that that range has decreased quite a bit, and that shows actual measurable progress. And 3 out of 5 teams indeed reduced the range of WIP. And then lastly, we looked at flow efficiency, which is quite simply the ratio of active time over total elapsed time. So it allows teams in the tool to identify queuing stages, most often ready for testing, and then calculate that ratio. And what we saw was that for 3 of the 5 teams, their flow efficiency increased as we predicted. So we were just pumped at this point. I mean, we felt that we had been vindicated, that our hypotheses had been tested and shown to be accurate, at least in this small group. So we took it straight back to my boss.
And one of the things that she pointed out, which is totally fair, is that our sample size is pretty small, and it was. That was totally true. But nonetheless, she let us proceed with this, and we were really excited about that and ready to kind of further this quest to help our teams become more effective. So what made the biggest difference? I think one of the things that, we're all students of this book, Accelerate, by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Jean Kim. And one of the things is that, like, using these tools, again, we have Jira embedded in our organization. I think there's about 500 people in this organization. And the actionable Agile tools that we learned from Dan are like a plugin that help us get better reports through this. And they not only do that, but they really help us do this. They help us see things that we couldn't really see in the past. And there's a real big power to visualizing work by making work more transparent. And they did research. Accelerate is a book with a lot of data behind it. And so this is one of the guidelines that we follow. And then we really saw this, that some of the things that we've started to do as regular practice across many squads, more and more, each day, is taking a look in our daily stand-ups or our daily scrum meetings, daily stand-up meetings, and we're looking at the aging of tickets. And this was the one technique that we learned from this tool set that really helped us see any tickets that were blocked across time. So if every day you look at these aging tickets, every blue dot here corresponds to a Jira ticket you can hover over. You can look into details of the tickets. You can see how many days it's aging. You can talk about why. We read these from right to left, from top to bottom during stand-ups. That's what we advocate. And teams can really kind of see delays and really act together to move them forward. And it's not complicated to do. It was the easiest kind of low-hanging fruit from this whole thing. And it's connected to having decreased cycle times. And so, we got to a crossroads, like the old shoe picture that Tim showed earlier. It's easy to just kind of atrophy, let things slide, but we let things be like they've always been. But we found these new tools and techniques that we feel passionate about. We really feel like they can help our teams become more effective. There's a better way. But it's, a big task to try to diffuse all of these practices across our organization.
And so one of the first things that we wanted to look at is, we showed that cycle time stability had improved. And so now that we're stable, what should we focus on next? And we can see, if we look at one of these sample teams, this is a great example of stabilization. That line looks fairly close to flat. And this is a great thing because, as Dan says, your process cannot be predictable if it's not stable. So without that stability, it's hard to make any kind of accurate predictions on the future. But what we can see here, and again, we're looking at the cycle time trend, and it shows us that the 85th percentile is 30 days. So that means that anytime a ticket starts, 85% of the time it'll get done in 30 days or less. The problem with that is that this particular team is working on 2-week Scrum sprints, which means that they really ought to be aiming for 14 days or less. So obviously there's room for this team, now that they're stable, to work on things like reducing overall WIP and trying to get those cycle times, maybe breaking stories into smaller chunks and getting those cycle times down. Nevertheless, what we do have from this team is some predictability now that their cycle time is stable. This is a cumulative flow diagram. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's basically just showing all the work that's been done to date. And the only two important things, I'm not going to go into the details of a CFD, but the two important things here are those two lines. The top line is the arrival rate. That's how fast things are arriving into this team's process. And the bottom line is the departure rate, or how fast things are departing from the process. And what's really great about these two lines is that they're parallel. In fact, those rates match exactly. This is Nirvana from a predictability standpoint. It means that things are in perfect flow. Things are arriving at exactly the same rate that they're leaving. And from that, if a team can maintain that, they have predictability. And that sets us up for what we're really aiming for longer term with these tools, which is Monte Carlo based forecasting, which allows them to set aside the perils and effort involved in estimation and have predictions with a higher degree of confidence based on statistical modeling.
Yeah, so as our colleague Noah says, a lot of the work and an effort is really the beginning of the rocket blast. And once you get a bit of momentum, things get easier and easier. And it feels like we are starting to have greater momentum with this effort. And one of the things, and this is an update to our slides from when we gave this talk at Lean Agile London last month, was that this is now part of a larger initiative at Procore, like getting the actionable Agile toolkit used by more squads, helping squads kind of see and control their cycle times so they become stable so you can use it for forecasting, is part of a larger initiative. And this very thing that happened made this whole endeavor that we're embarking upon kind of more official and to give it more strength within our organization. So we're really happy to be part of a larger initiative that gets into KPIs that are inspired by Accelerate. So we're folded in, which is really nice. And the other thing is that we've started working with others. One of the learnings that we had when we did our study was that in order to sustain any training or new techniques, we really determined that we need local ownership. I mean, Tim and I are two people trying to influence 500, but we need people that are on the ground, that are really inspired and excited to collaborate with us, to teach locally, to coach locally, so that we can sustain the momentum that we have started. And so having the kind of formalization that our engineering managers' own cycle time stability is something that's happened recently and that we're communicating and recommunicating, and we're really partnering with engineering managers to take this forward. So it's a really exciting development. So we're kind of sharing the ownership, spreading the ownership, so ultimately we can be obsoleted from that, and it's all owned locally. And so another thing that we've done is this is a screenshot of what you can see. There's a link at the bottom here. Actionable Agile has an online game called Twig, the work in progress game. It's based on, I believe, the Get Kanban game, which was an in-person board game that teaches you can use this online game to understand and feel viscerally what it's like for your effectiveness when you lower your work in progress limits. So we've created a 2-hour training that we're giving to different squads, full squads at Procore, so they understand the impact of all of their work when they lower their WIP. And so we have this interactive training that we're really excited about. We also learned in the course of our study that we need to train whole teams together, whole squads together, not just point people or members from each squad to later teach their squad. We found greater success at adoption of these technologies by training the whole squad. And so we're really excited about this. And I think the other important thing here is that when we started out with this originally, we thought we would need a couple days training or at least a day of training to get moving with these techniques. But we discovered that that's very expensive and it costs a lot of time, and we're really busy building software. But what we found is that in as little as 2 hours, you can make big strides with these techniques. And so where's the future? We have different milestones. We have a 2-hour training that I said, this is kind of the journey spread into 2 parts. The milestones of this initiative as we go forward are just like this. We invite squads and we have them for a 2-hour training. And ideally we're co-training with these engineering managers or local point people who are excited about this technology. We want the squads to use the aging work in progress report in their stand-up, kind of that colorful chart that I showed earlier. And then we want them to use the scatter plots for data-driven retrospectives. So these are like some preliminary uses of these tools that we find make a big difference in our throughput, in our delivery of software. And once teams have mastered these kind of initial techniques, we have the second kind of chunk of milestones here. We will train on doing Monte Carlo simulations, integrating it into their planning meetings, and with the ultimate goal of having more predictable and stable cycle times. So we've also expanded out since we last spoke to this community. We've also expanded out to partner with our learning and development groups at Procore. We, again, our company is very strongly connected as a learning organization, and we found kind of more amp or more power for our initiative by working with learning and development to help us schedule the trainings, promote the trainings. So we're super excited about that. And it's not enough to kind of just have the training, get squads ramped up, and kind of hope for the best. So another thought that we have is scheduling regular check-ins with our local champions that are using these tools and techniques. And this is really kind of a long play. If we want to sustain these tools and techniques, many of them we know people are probably joining from other organizations that aren't using these techniques. So it's going to take us effort to keep it going. And so we'll, deliberately get the stuff into onboarding, as well as our teams change. Like many companies, it's inevitable that you're going to have changes in teams. Dynamic reteaming is the concept that some of you know about, and we need to support ongoing change. And ultimately, our goal is to obsolete ourselves from this activity, have this stuff kind of live on so that we can go focus on other areas of effectiveness that are not only good for Procore, but that are also good for our own kind of growth and learning. So I think that's all we have for now. We're happy to entertain questions using this interactive format, and thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, Heidi. Thanks, Tim. So there's
Carl, you're really quiet, by the way.
Thank you. I'd moved my headphones out of the way just to double mute, and I forgot to double unmute. Yeah, thanks for that. So there was some good chat going on there from a few people. So what I thought maybe we could do is just to actually first off, let me allow participants to unmute themselves. So if you've got a question to ask or you've got something to say, unmute yourself, dive in there, and kind of try and keep it fairly informal. But maybe to start with, there was kind of some conversation thread with Haroon and Tim and Heidi. I kind of wondered whether it's worth starting with Heidi or Tim, kind of summarizing some of the things you were talking about there in the chat.
Sure. So there were some questions around how the data is sourced, and it all, in our case, comes from Jira. There's a plugin that pulls from Jira's API, and there were questions about how the workflow stages are visualized. In the case of Procore, most teams are working in a Scrum-like fashion, so we don't have any grouped columns like you often see in Kanban. So like development active, development done, testing active, testing done. And then for flow efficiency, that's actually determined by the tool user. So teams will configure the flow efficiency chart and tell it which stages represent queuing stages. So for us at Procore, the most common queuing stage is ready for testing. That tends to be a push column. And that would be a manual testing phase where a QA will pull it off. So it lets them see the ratio of active work over total work.
Great, thanks. Haroon, did you want to kind of maybe add anything to any useful insights you got or anything you got out of the conversation that chat.
Thanks, Carl. Heidi and although amazing, because back a couple of weeks ago I went to that particular meetup, and I was just really intrigued about how the data was sourced, because I'm working with the client at the moment where we're quite advanced with actionable Agile, and I had a conversation with Jose as well. It was just that data, and I think, Carl, you hit the nail on the head there, which is about data hygiene, and there is something about the tool which is absolutely amazing. It's that I'm really, really interested in how we get from a state of Scrum, or have this kind of very, really cool columns, but going into detailed active and inactive states. And in Jira, I'm kind of struggling with it a little bit, so it's more of a tooling thing. But I found the talk very helpful. I like the experimental aspect of what you were kind of pitching there. So I'm kind of working with a few companies at the moment where we're doing quite similar. We're hypothesizing, experimenting, and then going back full circle to see how we're doing. So thank you very much for your insight. They're really helpful.
Yeah, so the data hygiene I kind of thought was interesting, because it's always one of the things that I struggle with new teams is you start capturing the data and you realize that the data is absolutely terrible because people aren't keeping it up to date. So I think you said something about cleaning, having a stage to clean that data or that window. So how did that work?
So I think one of the really interesting things about this tool, this kind of draws on the sentiment from the Accelerate book, is that visualizing your process is a really powerful tool. So we're visual animals as people. And without that ability to see those patterns, without the ability to see how decisions reflect in your process data, it's really easy to ignore the fact that you have problems, or to not even know that they exist. And so I think one of the really eye-opening moments after all the teams that we've taken through this is that first pull up of their data within the tool, and seeing things like work in progress that's been sitting there for a year. And it's not that it's actually been in progress for the team for a year. It's that they had stuff slip through the cracks and nobody ever went back to clean it up. So just kind of like that realization that they won't really be able to get anything out of this until they go and do an initial cleanup of their data gives them a motivating reason to go in and do so. As far as the ongoing hygiene of the data, Actionable Agile is a software program, and like any other software program, it's only as good as the data that's fed into it. Garbage in, garbage out is the same. And so I think, if teams have a motivation to use this tool, hopefully there's an accompanying motivation to keep their source data actually reflecting their process. Right? I mean, Jira was designed originally as a bug tracking software, and it turns out that it's really good at tracking tickets as they move through a process. It's not a be-all, end-all solution for all the concerns of an agile software development team, but it is really good at tracking tickets moving through a progress. And so, if teams use it that way and they use it effectively, the source data is then feeds into these visualizations quite well.
Yeah, and it just happened that this organization uses Jira. It's been using Jira for years. It's very much embedded into the organization. So I think the other thing is that when the squads are really excited usually to see how their data looks in this tool, because they do it right after they play Twig. So we play Twig, which is that work in progress game that we showed you, the one that says it was invented by Klaus Leopold, which is really cool. In that, you can look at, you kind of work with the sample board, and you can see these charts with that sample data. So at the end, and the teams are really excited, they're trying to like win. We use Zoom breakout rooms where they're playing Twig, and then they really want to see, well, how does our data look like? Okay, we see the sample data, but like, what does ours look like? So there's a little bit of momentum that we've noticed, and starting it out interactively with Twig. We don't lecture to them anymore about like, this is what this is, like lower your work in process. No, it's more like play this fun game, and then what does your day look like? So.
Great. Yeah, I always kind of find it's kind of chicken and egg, as people don't update the data if they think nobody's looking at it. So you just have to start looking at it and it looks rubbish, and then people question it, and then hopefully then they'll start cleaning it up.
That's an interesting question, like who is looking at the data? I think, as far as we're concerned right now, we're kind of, it's like kind of analytics for the squads to improve and to be able to answer the question, when will it be done? About an hour before this call, I was talking with one of our engineering managers, and in an organization within Procore that they have to talk with enterprise customers every couple of weeks about their work and when is this next epic going to be done. They have these like ongoing conversations, and we found that, especially in a scenario like that, like people get a lot of value out of these tools.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else want to jump in with a question?
I've got a question, Carl. It's Anil.
Hey, go for it.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Tim. My internet connection's unstable actually, so I'm going to keep my video off. But I had a question. You mentioned dynamic reteaming towards the end of the talk. And when you're analysing the metrics and looking at how you performed historically, I take it you only look at the sections of time where the team size is the same, or did you kind of ignore the reteaming and just accept that that's part of the system itself?
So that's a good question. So we go by Dan's advice, which is like 12, 14 data points. Like just get your team started, hook up the tools, clean up your data if there's anything from before, and just start collecting data. And after about 12, 14 data points, you can start leveraging this for predictions. That's the general guideline that we go on from like that expert. That the guy that I talked to an hour ago, he's not on that team anymore that disbanded. He's on another team now, and he's joining another one after a few weeks. And so he'll be like kind of starting over with that team. Yeah, you just gotta just keep on keeping on and knowing that things are going to change.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, it depends at what level you're looking to make predictions. So generally, it is best to sample the most recent data that reflects the current state of reality for that team. But if you wanted to make longer term predictions, which of course the validity of longer term predictions starts to wane, your accuracy gets lower the further out you predict. You may want to then take into account the variation over some longer period of time where the team has reshuffled. But in general, it makes sense to use as much data as you can with the most recent accurate data reflecting in your source throughput.
Cool, thank you.
Hi, any other questions? Who else has a question?
Yeah, hi, it's Steve here.
Hi, Steve.
Hello. Thanks for the talk, it's really interesting. I'm just wondering, this might be the cynic in me coming from a big corporation, so warning. How do you stop the data from being misused? So how do you stop the people around the teams from taking hold of it, looking at it, and starting to incentivize them on being, predictable or whatever it might be, and just leaving it with the teams to improve?
That is an excellent question. There's always a danger, right? Any data can be weaponized. Heidi and I have specifically approached this from the team perspective. And in fact, when we pitched this to leadership, we made it very clear that we are not looking to use this as a metric to determine how teams are doing against each other. This is more, we see, an issue and it's not unique to Procore. We've seen this at lots of other companies where teams just aren't really aware of what they're capable of delivering in any period of time. They don't have confidence amongst themselves. So it's really difficult then to expect them to have confidence in making projections outward. And so, we approached it and made it very explicitly clear in our communication that this was a tool we were giving to teams. Beyond that, it does tend to get out of your control. Once it surfaces that this is a thing, then there's always the possibility of it being weaponized. I think in our case also, we were very careful in the initial set of metrics that we're pushing for now. We're looking for stability in cycle time, not actual cycle time numbers themselves, right? Because comparing one team to another when the constraints are different on those teams just is not, it's apples to oranges. But if we can say that all teams across the board stabilize their cycle time, that's an improvement that's relative to that team. It's improvement for everybody, but it's not something that can be weaponized.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, like focusing on that stability ties into sustainable pace. It's a concept that, we want people to have like a healthy work experience. That's very much part of our culture at Procore. And so focusing on this stability, then you can use it and you can solve that problem you have about like, they're asking you, when is it going to be done? And if you don't have a good strategy for that, it's like, it's a lot of stress. So we found that these techniques, we can kind of we talk about them as like they're stress lowering, we can work at a sustainable pace. The world is quite different now than it used to be. And it kind of matches with that too, that we want stability, we want kind of like stable and everything like that. And then, the nice thing is that like then using like the cycle time scatter plot and retrospectives, we encourage squads to come up with an experiment to see how you might impact your numbers. And, squads might set goals to have a lower cycle time, but it's not something that we emphasize out the gate. And we find that even by just looking at that delayed or that aging work in progress, it'll just kind of naturally lower the cycle times, and nobody has to try to control themselves. And, it's good to lower your work in progress, but even like just flipping it towards just look at the aging, and if that's the only thing you do, you could still see a pretty decent impact.
Yeah.
So I think at first, like when you saw that long slide of everything we asked of squads, we were super excited, like you could do this, that, this. It's like, oh my gosh, wow, we've been waiting for this for like 30 years. But then no, it's just kind of like aging tickets.
I would also
Move
say
them
that
along.
incentivizing predictability is actually a good thing. Incentivizing teams to be predictable, right? Incentivizing them to predictably deliver within some exact time frame is a different and dangerous slope to go down. But incentivizing all your teams to be predictable is good, right? And that goes again back to stability. Regardless of what your cadence is, if it's predictable and we can count on you to always deliver things on that cadence, that's a good thing, and that should be incentivized.
Yeah, like you said, that would be Nirvana, wouldn't it? It's just as long as they're in a psychological safety place as well, where they feel they're not having to game it or anything like that. I think that would be a lovely place to be.
And that's sort of the key here, is giving them tools where they can flex the muscle with those tools and gain confidence amongst themselves. Right? So just giving them the ability to say to each other, we feel confident that we can do this amount of work in this amount of time, and repeat that. That's where it all starts from.
We also just kind of respect the current tradition they may have. So we're not like out there trying to like stop estimating, or if they use story points, we really kind of punt on all that. And like, go ahead, just if that works for you, keep doing that. We try to expose people to these techniques as things that we've learned. And then we found that sometimes they'll just do this stuff in parallel, and then some might kind of get rid of the story points because they feel like maybe that's not helping us so much. Another person said, well, it raises our confidence to be able to do both. And so it's like, all right, cool. Like, we're glad to like help lower your stress and help you be more predictable.
The other question I had was, your teams, your squads, do they have coaches? Do they have team coaches, scrum masters, anything like that?
They do not currently.
No.
It is something I think the organization is looking for each team to have someone in that sort of a role, but how that's going to pan out and what the resourcing looks like and who takes on that role is still to be determined.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Who else has a question?
Hi, Mike here.
Hi, Mike, go for it.
So I was quite interested to get your opinion on something that you haven't talked about, but are assumingly doing in the future, which is your Monte Carlo simulation and forecasting. Do you want to just talk on that for a couple of minutes, what your strategy is? I see you've talked about using it during planning. You've not said whether that'll be sprint planning or release planning. I'm wondering whether sprint planning might be too often, maybe release planning is better, but just any thoughts around that?
So I think, our initial thoughts, and we've sort of communicated this with a few of the early adopters, is that people are skeptical of new tools and techniques. And this one in particular, because it proposes to give you, a more accurate probability-based model of forecasting than estimation does. People tend to be skeptical. So what we have suggested is that they try it in miniature. So try it at like the sprint level. So do all your normal ceremonies, do your estimating, do your story pointing, then also, once you've reached a point where your cycle time is reasonably stable, because predictability is not possible until you're at least somewhat stable, then ask the Monte Carlo simulation how many tickets you should be able to get done in a sprint, and compare the two at the end of the sprint and see, and do that over a few sprints, with the idea being gain some credibility, gain some belief and confidence in the tool and how to use it, and then extrapolate from there and do release planning, do things that span multiple sprints, that maybe like a feature or a couple of features that belong in a release. We have found that people's natural instinct when we ask them to plan a release with a Monte Carlo simulation is that they are just incredulous. They lack any confidence that it will give them the results that they're looking for. Also, it's part of a mental shift in thinking about an exact date versus thinking about a range of dates and probabilities associated with hitting those dates. So it's like it's an opportunity for teams to flex that muscle.
Yeah, I think you'll find that Monte Carlo will give you that, at least in terms of release planning, quite neatly. I guess my worry was always, as you say, if you're using existing data and your last 2 weeks have had a really poor data set, using that to predict out the future might be tricky and inaccurate. But aggregating over a slightly longer period of time might give you a slightly flatter view of reality and a little bit more predictability. It's just a thought.
For certain, and I think also, the other learning angle here for teams is that no matter how diligent they are at trying to figure out what constitutes a release, because in order to do this with Monte Carlo simulations, you have to get some idea of the number of tickets it's going to take to complete a release. But you'll always be wrong, right? Just like with estimations are at best an educated guess. And teams will find as the work progresses that this story is actually 2 or 3, or we forgot about this aspect, which is going to add a few stories. And I think one of the mental hurdles teams are trying to get over is, okay, well, that means that we need to then start from scratch again. And it doesn't. It just means you need to take the data that has changed and adjust your forecast based on that. Add a couple of tickets, subtract the ones that are already done, and ask it, okay, from today, then what does it look like to get the remaining tickets done? And the advantage of it is because if you're using Jira correctly and tracking those tickets, you don't have to do anything additional. You can reforecast for free versus the traditional estimation where you would need then to go back into a room and figure out how does this change things? How much additional time do each of these tickets add on? Which ones can be done consecutively versus concurrently? You get that reforecasting effectively for free.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. The one thing about Monte Carlo, of course, is the splitting. So story splitting is still something that you have to sort of predict. You're going to split out every 4 stories, every 10 stories. Hopefully you've got the data to back that up, but there's still a degree of estimation there, and hence its degree of inaccuracy. So it'd be very interesting, I think, if you are going to use this over any period of time, to go back and say, the last time we predicted this, how accurate were we 3 months later? And then to see if there's overestimation, underestimation, actually in things like story splitting and stuff like that.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's going to be like a really interesting part of the learning path here is, closing the loop on those forecasts that you gave and kind of learning from that. Yeah.
Oh, great talk. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. One thing I was thinking, I think you alluded to right at the end there, which is you can go back to last month and then forecast forward again from last month to now and see how close the forecast is to what you've actually done. So rather than kind of forecasting now and waiting a month, and then you could adjust the model and reforecast.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we could do that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, just maybe on that, it's the story splitting thing that's a little tricky there, because if you go back historically, you've already split out those stories. There's nothing that's very easy in Jira to say at that point in time, how many stories had we not split out yet that we subsequently found we needed to. And that becomes the tricky part. That becomes the art more than the science, maybe.
I think in Action Agile, you would go back to literally the data a month ago. So even before you've split any stories and added new stories. But yeah, you'd need to take that into account.
think there's
Okay.
something there about
Yeah.
kind of like going back and learning from the data even now, like how could we leverage that today as like a teaching or learning technique to illustrate what could be?
There, that's something
I
Troy
think what's key is that, you know, that this tool doesn't take all the responsibility off teams to still figure out like how to scope a release and how to plan stories and things like that. What it does relieve is the pressure and inaccuracy of time and date-based estimates on those stories and sequencing and things like that that are exceptionally difficult to do. It turns out human beings are, after about 16 hours worth of work, we are incredibly bad at estimation. And it's a perilous exercise that's usually time-consuming and demoralizing when you find out you're wrong. I know I've been involved in teams that have gone like at the beginning of a sprint offline for 8 hours trying to estimate everything that's going on, and we were usually wrong.
Yeah, I certainly think that's where the whole sort of best case, worst case scenario, rather than giving an absolute estimate, is key, and is something that needs to be sort of embedded and imbued within an organization, that they understand that you're not going to give absolutes, you're going to give predictability, you know, you're going to give percentage that you're going to hit a certain target. So,
and the real power of that is that's sort of how the world works anyway, right? I mean, we're always dealing with ranges and probabilities, and that's, at the end of the day, that's also how our customers think, right? In terms of being able to capitalize on a feature we're delivering to them, it's about risk. How much risk are they willing to deal with? So the more that we can communicate in those terms, the more likely we are to have realistic outcomes.
I remember in a talk once somebody saying that if your project manager ever asks you for a due date, for an absolute date, give them a best case, worst case scenario, because all that they're doing is they're trying to offload their problems onto you, make you liable for their work. So
the minute you commit to the best case scenario, the clock is ticking and you've basically screwed yourself.
Exactly. Put it up your hand.
I thought we had wholehearted teams where everybody in the project team actually took responsibility for things, not project managers that offloaded things.
All right, thank you. It's 4 minutes to 8, so that's probably a good time just to kind of wrap up the Q&A. So Heidi, Tim, I don't know whether you want to, any kind of closing remarks, thoughts you want to summarize? So I sprung that on you. I didn't tell you I was going to do that.
Just you know, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening, and the fantastic questions. And you know, we certainly would love to hear any success stories and challenges, things like that. Thanks again.
Yeah, Tim said it very well there. Yeah, if anything comes to mind, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever. We're students of this, you know. It's exciting to learn, and this is the work we're doing right now. So.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you for.
Can I be really cheeky and sneak in one last question?
Yeah, go for it. It's a quick one. Yeah.
One last request more than anything else. Are you guys going to be writing up any blog post where maybe you're going to do lessons learned? So, you know, what you found that worked really well, possibly would work in other organizations, what didn't work?
Well, we might now.
Yeah, I think it would be, for our effort, I think it would be good for us to do something like that, and then also kind of co-author it with some of the engineering manager enthusiasts who are kind of helping to teach and diffuse these practices. I think they become opinion leaders to help us get more squads, you know, onboarded to this. So I think something like that is probably a good idea.
We should be looking at ourselves as a worldwide community, helping each other out, right? So
yeah, it's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Yeah, thank you very much. So we'll upload the recording of this up onto YouTube and share that. And we also have Heidi and Tim have given me the slides, so I'll put a link to that on the meetup page probably. Great. Thanks very much, everybody, and we'll let you know when the next session is, and see you then, hopefully. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
All right. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.